In this lecture, we'll learn how we decide how many layers a particular RNN has. What is the factor that determines the number of layers in an RNN? We've seen that the basic structure of a recurrent neuron is a little different from that of regular neurons. Recurrent neurons feed the output that it produced in the previous time instance back again to its input, and this is how they remember state or have memory. We've seen that neural networks made up of regular neurons use back propagation for their training process. Recurrent neurons are also trained using back propagation, but a slightly tweaked variation. Let's study that here. So far, we've just spoken of a single recurrent neuron that is unrolled through time, and we said that this makes up the layers of a neural network. Now, that was slightly misleading because when you have a neural network with several different layers, it's unlikely that you have just one neuron in a single layer. Typically, when you work with recurrent neural networks, you have a group of neurons which come together to form something known as a memory cell. You have the x of t input to this group of cells. The output is y of t, which is then fed back again to the input. So y of t minus 1 becomes the input to this group of cells at time instance t. This group of neurons, and there can be any number within this group, forms an RNN cell. This is called a recurrent neural network cell, a memory cell, a basic cell, LSTM cell, and GRU cell are variations of a memory cell. Each of these memory cells have their own special characteristics that make them well suited for problems of certain types. We'll study these specific cells a little more later on in this course. It's not a single recurrent neuron that's unrolled through time. It is this memory cell that's unrolled through time, forming the layers of the neural network. So, the layers of the neural network each have the number of neurons that you've specified for this memory cell. The layers that you see depicted on screen is the same memory cell at different instances in time. Notice that the output of the previous time instance is fed in as an input to the next time instance. Exactly as in the case of neural networks, recurrent neural networks are also trained via the gradient descent optimization process or variations of those. Depends on what optimizer you use, but the basic gradient descent process remains the same. Let's quickly recap how gradient descent works and how we use it to find the best parameters W and B for our machine learning model. Once again, we'll work with a simple linear regression example because it is a very simple formula which connects the inputs to the outputs. Y is equal to Wx plus B. The training process for linear regression is responsible for finding those parameters W and B which give us the best fit regression line. And the best fit regression line is defined as that line which minimizes the mean square error of all the points from the line. If you were to consider a neural network, there are, of course, many weights and biases that have to be trained in order to find your best fit machine learning model. You have as many weights and biases as there are connections between neurons in your neural network. Now, the reason we visualize gradient descent optimization for linear regression is that we can plot the weights and the bias that we have to train in a three-dimensional axis. We have the weights on one axis, biases on another axis, and the mean square error, that is the loss which we have to minimize on the third z axis. Now, if you have your parameters W and B take on all possible combinations of values, calculate the mean square error, and then you were to plot them on this graph, you might get a curve which looks like this. This is, of course, a hypothetical curve, but you can imagine that you'll get some kind of curve. When you run the training process for your linear regression model, what you're really looking for is that value of a W and B for which you have the smallest mean square error. That is your best value of the bias and best possible value for weights. In order to find the smallest possible value for the mean square error, you have to start somewhere. So you'll randomly initialize your weight and bias parameter to some value along the slope. And from this initial value of the MSE, your optimizer will try to descend down the slope to get to the point where we have the smallest value for the mean square error. This is your training process. We'll converge on the best possible value for W and B. This is the objective of our optimization algorithm. The entire purpose of the training process is to find these best possible values. And if you generalize these to a neural network, the entire purpose of the training process is to find the best possible values of all weights and biases for all the interconnections between neurons. This basic optimization process is the same when carried out in a neural network. Neural networks are trained via a process called backpropagation. Here, you feed in a bunch of training data and receive an output, and at the output, you compare the prediction with the actual label. You get some kind of error that you calculate using the cost function or the loss function. You feed in this error to the optimizer, which then calculates the weights and biases and how they have to be tweaked for the very last layer first. Once we have the weights and biases for the last layer before the output, the training process then moves backwards and calculates the weights and biases for the previous layer, till it gets all the way back to the input. Because this moves backwards through the neural network, this training process is called backpropagation. The main purpose of backpropagation is to allow the weights and biases of all the neurons to converge to their final values. Now, backpropagation works really well, and in fact, it was a major breakthrough in the idea of training neural networks, which allowed us to work with deeper and deeper neural networks. But backpropagation as an iterative process can fail under two conditions. It will fail if the gradients don't change at all, or if the gradients change too fast. When the gradients don't change at all, that is the vanishing gradient problem. We start off with some initial value of the MSE, and then instead of descending down the slope of our loss curve, we simply hang around at the same position. The loss does not change, the gradient becomes zero and stops changing. The other problem that we can have is the exploding gradient problem. We start off at some initial value of the MSE, and then the gradient explodes or goes suddenly up and spikes down randomly. Once again, the training process will not converge if we have either the vanishing or the exploding gradient problem. Now, this recap was important, and it is especially significant when we talk of recurrent neural networks, because training recurrent neural networks have specific challenges dealing with vanishing and exploding gradients. A group of neurons form an RNN memory cell. This RNN memory cell is unrolled through time for as many time instances for which we have data. So let's say you have enough data for, say, 20 time instances. The memory cell will be unrolled 20 times, and your recurrent neural network will have 20 layers. The number of time periods for which we have data determines the number of layers in our recurrent neural network.